All right, let's unpack the story just a little. Sara Gon is a policy fellow from the South African Institute of Race Relations. She joins us now in studio. Thanks for coming in, Sara.
Okay.
So, I mean, perhaps we talked about it just a little bit before coming on air, but where are we in terms of our hate speech legislation at the moment?
Essentially, we have a number of avenues that some have existed for a very long time to deal with. Usually it's racism or defamation or utterances of that nature. You can sue for defamation, you can sue for crimen injuria, which is criminal defamation. So there's your criminal arm to deal with issues like this. The Equality Court exists for exactly this purpose, and it's not a criminal court. So the onus to prove racism or racist speech is much lower than a criminal court. So all of these avenues, plus the South African Human Rights Commission's investigatory powers before that, are all available to be used.
And what's your take on this new bill?
It's got a number of problems. First of all, I think it's been born out of on an emotional basis, and I'm not sure that a bill like this would have existed if there weren't the proliferation of social media. It's also unconstitutional because its scope goes beyond the Constitution, and basically any legislation on a subject covered by the Constitution has to act within the scope of it cannot go beyond that. So one of the real problems with this legislation, for example, is that essentially it prohibits, let's call it insult. So if somebody posts something insulting and a news team repeats it because it's part of the news, the mere repeating of that could be an act of hate speech, as defined by the proposed bill. What we see, what the essence of it is, it really limits free speech, which is contrary to what the Constitution requires.
I mean, there's a lot of human rights activists who are also saying that the bill will in fact threaten the country's democracy. That's obviously not the intention of the bill.
It's not the intention, but it goes to a very controlling mindset. It goes to a non-democratic, non-liberal mindset, because it's generally accepted that in a liberal democracy, insult is accepted. That's part of free speech, however awful it is. And it's only in very limited circumstances, such as the promotion of violence, as envisaged by the Constitution, that your right to free speech is limited. And ugly as speech often can be, the sign of a democratic, robust society is, in fact, the right to say things other people don't necessarily want to hear.
I mean, in the case of, let's talk about Vicky Momberg. She's someone who's been in the news recently for this exact reason. A case like this would be what perhaps necessitates, or what lawmakers think necessitates a bill like this. Do you agree with that, or do you think there's another way of dealing with this issue around racism, hate speech?
Okay. I think there's a number of issues. One is the fact that Vicky Momberg has in fact been dealt with by the system. She's gone through the Human Rights Commission, she's gone through the Equality Court, she's gone through the criminal courts, and she's been sentenced to 3 years in prison with 1 year suspended, which is an extraordinary amount. It is allowed by law, it's just that it's not happened to that extent before. Now that's quite a lot of legal redress, if I can put it that way. The problem is that when you've let's use racism because it is the issue. The problem is that if you shout hard enough at people you accuse of being racist or saying racist things, it's not going to make them less racist. I'm sure someone like Penny Sparrow is genuinely remorseful. I don't think she had any idea of what she was saying was going to lead to what it did. Vicky Momberg is a different story. I mean, absolutely no remorse that she said it, no appearing to understand or appreciate that it was racist speech, hateful speech. But the problem is that the reaction of anyone to being sort of accused and shouted at over racism is to either retreat, and it sort of goes under the table and is not really dealt with, and it's not debated. That's the most problematic thing. Or people react aggressively back, and they either up the stakes, they express more racism. So what's happened is you haven't really, if people have done something bad, you haven't really tackled them in a way that they can learn from and come back from. They are almost forced into a corner, if I can put it that way.
And we see that a lot playing out on social media, in fact.
Absolutely, all the time.
How would you recommend that the country I mean, we're obviously struggling as a country to deal with this issue of racism. We're not having perhaps the right discussions around it. But what's your take on how to deal with it and how to start that kind of discussion?
I think there are two ways. One is leadership is crucially important. So if your leaders don't say things that can be construed as racist, it has less impetus to the rest of society. And leaders are very important from that point of view. And the terrible obvious example is the Hitler Nazi regime of the 30s and 40s. So you take it out of the public sphere. The other thing is people must be allowed, when they go onto social media, when they go onto radio stations, to express a view that the person hearing it may not agree with, but they mustn't be lambasted from every corner. They must at least be heard. If they're heard, you then can hear what it is you can tackle them on. But if you don't listen to them, you can't hear what it is you've got to fight back with. The other thing is that to some extent no society is race-free, particularly any homogenous, any multicultural society. There are always going to be pockets or periods of racism. And it's not nice, but it's not entirely unnatural. So to try and change people's attitudes and to educate out of it is not an easy or a fast process.
Yes, because who says those people want to have their attitudes changed or want to be educated out of it?
In fact, what you get from the law that exists is by saying we can jail you or you can pay a huge fine. That forces a person to change their behavior. And if you can get
on the surface.
On the surface, but changing of behavior, becoming politer, becoming more considerate, being aware of other people and where they're coming from, ultimately changes attitudes. In other words, attitude is usually, the change of attitudes is a consequence of a change of behavior, not the other way around.
Yeah. Or does the force of a change of behavior make me simmer more on the inside?
It depends how you're dealt with.
Yeah.
It does depend how you're dealt with. And at the moment, I think that is our problem, is the seething inside.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a discussion that still has a long way to go. Thanks very much for coming into the studio. Sara Gon is a policy fellow from the South African Institute of Race Relations.